Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In this episode, you're going to learn how to accept a one-time payment using a custom form with the payment element. If you're looking for a simpler integration path, we have the no-code payment links option where you can set up a payment link directly through the dashboard and then share that with your customers through social media, email, text message, etc. Alternatively, there's another option called Stripe Checkout. This is a very simple integration that has one API call on the server. You redirect your customer to a Stripe hosted page. But in today's episode, we're going to talk about integrating the payment element. This allows you to build your own custom hosted form and collect lots of different payment method types. So the payment element supports anything from cards all the way to bank accounts. You've got support for wallets like Google Pay and Apple Pay, all the way to buy now, pay later like Affirm and Afterpay, ClearPay. So it is a great option for building your own custom form to accept a one-time payment. So just as a quick roadmap for today, we're going to install a sample, and we're going to go through the dashboard and talk about how you can enable payment methods. These are going to be those payment methods that are dynamically rendered into the payment element every time the page loads. And then we're going to create a payment intent on the server and use its client secret to render the payment element on the client so that we can collect payment details from the customer. We'll ultimately submit that payment to Stripe. And then we're going to handle any of those post-processing events. We're going to talk about webhooks and a few other considerations that you might want to think about as you're building out your integration. So let's get into it. All right, so this is Visual Studio Code. This is our editor we're going to use today. On the left side, you'll notice that we have this S for Stripe. This is the Stripe for VSCode extension. If you don't already have this extension installed, you can head over to the extension gallery, search for Stripe, and install it there. The tool we're going to use today from the Stripe for VSCode extension is to start with a Stripe sample. And so we can search for the starter sample. And what we want to do is use the main integration with HTML on the front end, and we're going to use .NET on the back end. We'll name this starter.net. And this is going to clone down an example repository that has sort of a basic end-to-end skeleton of an example that we're going to use today. It'll also set some API keys for us. It's going to create an environment variable file that is inside the server directory in .env. You'll notice that we have our publishable key and our secret key already pre-populated for us. That's because the Stripe for VS Code extension set that up because we've already authenticated with the Stripe CLI. If you go over to the .env file in the root of your server directory and you don't see these environment variable values entered, you'll want to go to the Stripe dashboard and grab your API keys from there and drop them into this .env file. Now, we get a couple different things as part of this sample. We have a client directory that's going to have some simple HTML. Right now, it just has this h1 tag. And then on the server, we're using the .NET minimal API here. And, to start off, we're seeing a bunch of squigglies. That's because we haven't actually built our application yet. So I'm going to jump into the server directory and say .NET run. And that will clone down our dependencies from NuGet. It's going to fire up our server. And now we can go over to the browser and browse to localhost 4242, and we just see this h1 tag that says sample. All right, so let's take a look at this server file. So it's a fairly vanilla .NET minimal API implementation. We are configuring a Stripe options object with a bunch of environment variables. Those, again, came from that .env file. We're also setting up some services, specifically the iStripe client, and we're going to inject another service for the payment intent, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. You'll also see that we are setting some app info here. You can actually delete that when going to production. It's just for debugging purposes. We've got static files that we're serving. That's so that we can just use this very basic front end with HTML and JavaScript. And finally, we've got a couple of routes here, one for fetching our publishable key from the server and one for handling webhooks. Now, it is a best practice to fetch the publishable key from the server instead of hard coding that on the client. And the reason is that if you ship a mobile app for iOS or Android, then it's common that users will install the application one time and they might not ever update that application. And so if you have to roll your publishable keys for some reason, you want to make sure that you can fetch those from the server. So we're going to expose the publishable key directly from the server. And then when we want to go through the fulfillment process for any payments, we're going to use our webhook handler. So we have a webhook already scaffolded out here. We'll just need to come down and create a new maybe switch or condition based on the type of the event that we're receiving. In the example scaffold here, it shows checkout session completed, but we're not using checkout today. We're going to use payment element. So that's what we get as part of the sample, and we're ready to jump in and start implementation. Now from the Stripe dashboard, we can head over to the settings and to the payment method settings. This is where we can manage our payment methods and enable or disable different ways that customers can pay through our payment element. So you'll see here that we have cards enabled, Link, Apple Pay, Google Pay, several different wallet methods. There's lots of different bank redirects. These are popular across Europe. We also have some buy now, pay later payment methods that are enabled. Finally, we even have ACH direct debit as one of the payment methods that customers could use. Now, if we wanted to enable Canadian pre-authorized debits, we could click turn on, and this would enable us to use Canadian pre-authorized debits as a payment method type inside of our payment flows. So this is where we manage our payment methods. And these are the payment methods that will be dynamically derived inside of our payment element when we render that and show it to customers. So that's how you enable and manage your payment methods. Instead of needing to deploy any new code, you can just come into the dashboard and enable or disable different payment method types. All right, so this is an overview of the payment flow that we're going to implement today. When a customer lands on our page, we're going to make an AJAX request back to our server. From the server, we're going to make an API call to Stripe to create this thing called a payment intent. Stripe will return a payment intent object to us that has this client secret property that we're going to send back to the front end and then use that to ultimately render the payment element. So let's jump into the server and we're going to add an endpoint that's going to make this API call. So here inside of the server, we're going to add a new app.map post, and this is going to be to create payment intent. We're going to accept in the HTTP request as rec. We're also going to inject this other service called a payment intent service. This is a class that's available as part of stripe-dotnet, and it enables us to interact with all of the payment intent endpoints. So what we want to do now is go to our service registry here and say builder.services.add singleton, and we're going to pass in that class there so that we can get back this payment intent service that will be already like constructed for us. Okay, so now what we can do is actually make our API call. So because we have the Stripe for VS Code extension installed, we have these snippets available. So we can say Stripe payment intent create and hit tab, and that'll auto-populate all of the code that we need for making this API call. So at the top here, we're constructing this thing called a payment intent create options. This is the arguments that we're going to send to the API. Then the snippet is automatically creating a new instance of this payment intent service, but that's injected, so we can actually just pull that down. And then finally, we are making the API call to Stripe on this line here on line 60. The service has two different methods. One is create, another is create async. And this will allow us to use the async await pattern to get back a payment intent. So I can say payment intent is going to be the result of this call. Now, the arguments to the API, we can change these up a little bit. The amount is going to be 1099. It's an integer value of the smallest denomination possible for our given currency. So if we're talking about USD, this is going to be $10.99 or 1,099 cents. We can also change our currency if we wanted to euros. Instead of hard coding payment method types, we're going to enable automatic payment methods. So I can do this by passing in this new object that we're going to configure to say we want to enable these automatic payment methods so that our payment methods that are displayed in the payment element are derived based on those settings that we just configured inside of the Stripe dashboard. Finally, we need to return the client secret property for this payment intent back to the front end. So we're going to say return results.ok. And we're going to just pass in a new object here that we're going to create with the client secret being the payment intents.client secret. And we should be good to go. So let's open up our terminal here. We'll restart our server. And then we're going to start a second terminal session by clicking the plus there. We're going to make a curl request to localhost 4242/create payment intent just to confirm that our endpoint is working as expected. We got back this JSON that has the client secret property and the string value for that payment intents client secret. This is great because this is the tool that we need to use on the front end to render the payment element. All right, let's turn our attention to the front end. So I'm going to open up index.html here. And right now it has an H1 of sample. We're going to say accept a payment. And we also need to add a form where we're ultimately going to collect payment. So we're going to say this form is going to have an ID of payment form. And inside of this form, we're going to add a couple of different things. The first is going to be a div with the ID payment element. Now this is just an empty container for now, but this is where we will ultimately render that payment element. We're also going to have a div here called error messages. And that's just going to be where we populate any error messages that we receive as the result of attempting to submit payment to Stripe. So if there's any errors at all, we'll just render those out into that div. And finally, we're just going to add a simple button here that says pay. So let's save that. We're going to open up our terminal again. Okay, we've got our server running and localhost 4242 now looks like this. Notice we just have a button, but we don't actually see the payment element. So at the top, inside of the head of our index.html, we'll notice that we are loading stripe.js from js.stripe.com. That is a best practice. We want to do that on every page to decrease fraud. We also need another script tag because we're going to write some JavaScript on the front end that is going to mount that payment element. So I'm going to say script source is going to be /payment.js. We're going to create a new file here and save it in the client directory. And we're going to call it payment.js. Now, when the DOM is fully loaded, we're going to do a couple things. The first is fetch the publishable key from the server. Then we're going to create the payment intent on the server. And finally, we're going to mount our elements. All right, so we're going to use the fetch API today. And we're going to make this first request back to /config. And that will return a promise that will resolve with a response object, and we want the JSON off of that object. Now that JSON method is also going to return a promise that we can await, and we can pull off the publishable key. Okay, now we want to use that publishable key to initialize an instance of the Stripe object. So we're going to say call Stripe and pass in the publishable key. This Stripe constructor function comes from that stripe.js script that is loaded on index.html. Now that we have this instance of Stripe, we need to create the payment intent on the server. So let's make another fetch call. This one is going to be to create payment intent. And we're going to pass in an options block here that's going to allow us to specify that the method for this request should be a post request. And we also want to pass in some headers here. We'll say that the content type is application JSON. Now again, if we wanted to, here we could pass in a body. A couple of things we might do from the front end is pass back maybe like a product ID or something that we could then look up our products in the database so that we could determine what price or what amount that we want to charge. But today we're just going to leave this body off and we're hard coding that $10.99. Okay, this fetch call is also going to return a promise with this response object. And again, we want the JSON off of that. And ultimately, this is going to return a promise that we want to get the client secret property from. This client secret property is going to be used for our elements group. So the next step here is that we want to construct an elements group. So we're going to say elements is stripe.elements. Now, if you're familiar with the older style legacy card element that just collects card payments, then the old way that we would do this is just by calling stripe.elements, getting back an elements group. Now, when we're talking about the payment element, the elements group accepts in an argument, which is this options block that has the client secret property of the payment intent. And that's because these elements need to know information about the payment intent, like what are the payment method types that are enabled for this payment intent, and also what is the currency of the payment intent so that it can properly render the accurate payment method types that it wants to support. Okay, the next thing we want to do is create a payment element from this elements group. So we're going to say elements.create and we pass in the string payment. And finally, we're going to mount that. So we're going to say payment element.mount, and we pass in the CSS selector for the div or container where we want to mount that payment element. So that matches with the ID of this div. Okay, so now at this point, if we refresh the page, you'll notice that the payment element is now rendering. This is fantastic. Okay, so we can see that we can accept card payments or ideal payments, or even a lot of other different payment method types that are supported by Euros. So this is really great. But if we were to submit or click on the pay button right now, nothing is actually happening. That's because we have not actually submitted payment to Stripe yet. So we're going to do that with JavaScript here in just a bit. So to submit payment to Stripe, we want to grab reference to that form element. So we're going to say document.get element by ID, payment form. And this is going to give us back a form object that we can then add some event listeners to. So form.add event listener for submit. And when the form is submitted, we want to prevent the default so that we don't actually cause a full page submission. And then finally, we want to submit the payment to Stripe. So we're going to call stripe.confirmPayment. Now this method, again, takes in an object. And one of the things that we must include in that object is reference back to the elements group that we created earlier. We can also pass some confirm params, which would include the return URL. Now, the return URL is where the customer will be redirected after they finish the payment flow. Now, if you are using card payment, for instance, or some payment method type that does not require a redirect, you can also control and configure that here. For now, we're going to use this default, and we're going to say that our return URL is actually just going to be window.location.href. We're going to split on the question mark in case there's a query string. And we're just going to add on complete.html. So we're just going to redirect to some page called complete.html. We haven't actually implemented that yet, so we'll need to go do that next. Now, stripe.confirmPayment is going to return a promise, and that promise might resolve with an error property. Now, if there's an error, we're going to use that error messages div and populate that with the message that is on the error received. So we're going to say error messages is document.get element by ID, error messages, and then we're going to say error messages.inner text is equal to error.message, and we should be good to go. All right, let's take this for a spin. We're going to enter in some test card details. So all 4 twos and a future expiration and any CVC and a valid zip code, and we can hit pay. So that submitted payment, and we were redirected to this page that says complete.html. You'll notice in the query string for this page, we also see the ID of the payment intent and the client secret of the payment intent. So we'll use these in the next step in order to render this confirmation page for completion. All right, let's create a new page here, and we're going to save this as complete.html in the client directory. And we're just going to start off by copying some of the HTML that's over here in our index route. We're going to make a new JavaScript file called complete.js, and we need to add some closing tags here, and we're going to format. All right, we're off to the races. So this is going to be called complete. And then we're just going to add a pre-tag here with the ID of payment intent. We'll render out the JSON for the payment intent into this pre-tag. You can use your imagination for what this might actually look like in practice. So for now, we just see this complete header, and we need to go implement complete.js. So we're going to create a new file here. We're going to call it complete.js, and we'll save that. Again, when the DOM is fully loaded, we're going to fetch the publishable key, and then we're going to retrieve the payment intent and render. Okay, so our publishable key is again going to be something that we can fetch from /config. And we're going to initialize an instance of the Stripe object, which we'll use in order to re-retrieve the payment intent. We need to know the client secret for the payment intent in order to re-retrieve it. So we're going to pull that out of the query string parameters by saying params is new URL search params using window.location.href. And then we can grab off the client secret by saying params.get payment intent client secret. And finally, we can call stripe.retrieve payment intent, passing in that client secret. And we're going to get back a promise that we can then await, which will resolve with the payment intent from the API. Finally, we want to grab reference to that payment intent pre-tag, say document.getElement by ID payment intent. And we'll say payment intent pre.inner text is going to be equal to JSON.stringify of the payment intent. I'm going to pass in null2 so that it looks nice, and we'll refresh our page. That is the JSON for the payment intent. So here we can see things like the amount for the payment intent, the status of the payment intent, all the different payment method types that were rendered. We even have the ID of the payment method that we might want to store off. Now, in practice, we do not want to use this completion page as the signal for whether or not we should fulfill payment. So once someone lands on this page, we don't want to use this as the way to know that payment was successful. There's a whole bunch of different reasons for that. For instance, they could close their browser, their internet could die, their battery might die on their computer or phone. So we don't want to actually use the loading of this completion page. Instead, we want to use webhooks. So we're going to talk about that in the next step. All right, let's take a quick look at how we can use the Stripe for VS Code extension to build and test our webhook endpoint. Recall that in program.cs here we have a webhook handler that is listening for post requests from Stripe, and if the event type is one of payment intent succeeded, then we want to execute some code here. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull off the payment intent, which is going to be available inside of the stripe event.data.object, and we need to cast this to a stripe.payment intent. It's going to be an instance of a payment intent object. And finally, we're just going to log out the payment intent ID, and we'll just put like a little money bag emoji here inside of the terminal just so that we can see that. Okay, I'm going to remove these comments, and we should be good to go. So let's restart our server, and then we're going to use the Stripe for VS Code extension. And if we look at under the events section, one of the tools is called forward events to your local running webhook handler from Stripe. So here we're going to specify which URL endpoint we want to forward those events to. So localhost 4242/webhook. This is going to be for our account endpoint. This is all of the events that are firing on our own Stripe account. It will form a direct connection between Stripe and our local running machine so that events are delivered to us. Now in the logs for listen down here, so the listen command is what's actually being used in order to forward these events, we will see different events that are firing. Now, by default, my Stripe account uses the 2019-05-16 API version. That does not match the latest API version, and so some of the shapes for objects that are going to be sent to my webhook endpoint are not going to be the same. And so what I need to do is actually start the listener with -L. So that's not actually supported by the Stripe for VS Code extension, but if you're setting up your Stripe account, it is on the latest version, and you can see the latest version here, and your stripe.net client library is also pinned to that latest version, then you should be good to go. So what I'm going to do is actually cancel that out and say stripe listen -- forward to localhost 4242/webhook. Now I'm going to use the -L command so that when it fires up the listener, it's using the latest API version. This will match the API version that my local version of stripe.net is pinned to, so that the shape of the events that are coming in match that API version. All right, so now if we were to head back over to localhost 4242 and reload the page, you'll notice that a brand new payment intent is being created. That's because as soon as the page loads, we're making that AJAX request to the server's making the API call to Stripe. When that API call is made, this payment intent.created event fires. So if we wanted to, we could build automations around, how many times are payment intents being created and then not actually being succeeded. So you can imagine some tools around, measuring your conversion based on some of these events. All right, so let's go back through the payment flow one more time. We're going to use this 4242 card again and click on pay. Now you'll notice that several different events fired, including this payment intent.succeeded event. This is the output again for the listen command, which is forwarding those events to our local machine. So now if we look at the server log for .NET, you'll notice that this payment intent with the ID being printed out here is that code that we just added as part of our webhook handler. Again, you do want to use webhooks for any and all fulfillment. You don't want to use this completion page or loading of this completion page for fulfillment. There are several different event types that are related to payment intents and also to all objects inside of the Stripe API. So you'll want to head over to the documentation and take a look at what event types are supported. Now, when you go to production, you won't actually use the Stripe CLI or Stripe for VS Code extension to forward those webhooks. Instead, you'll go to your Stripe dashboard and configure webhooks. We have several episodes all about setting up your webhooks. So head over to the Stripe Developers YouTube channel and check out the webhook handling for .NET. You might be wondering how to test out your integration. Well, over in the documentation for accepting a payment, you can drill down into the test integration section, and for each of the different payment method families between cards, wallets, bank redirects, etc., there are several different things that will allow you to test different scenarios. So for instance, we can grab this card, this test card that ends in 3155, and we can use that as one of our test cards inside of the payment element. And you'll notice that as we go through the payment flow here, this will trigger a secure customer authentication payment flow. So this is going to pop up a modal, and in production, this modal would contain a bank account, 2FA, or sort of like a one-time code or some way to verify that the customer is who they say they are and that they are allowed to authenticate this payment. So that's one way that you can test sort of 3D secure and secure customer authentication is with that special card number. Another thing worth noting is in the documentation, there are some optional steps depending on specific payment method types or QR code-based payment methods. These might require that you pass additional details when creating the payment intent, or they might have other considerations like with Apple Pay, you'll need to go into the dashboard and make sure that you have an Apple Pay domain set up and verified. So just to review the entire flow, the customer lands on the page, and we use any information from that page to create a payment intent using the API. And then when we return that payment intent's client secret to the client, we use that to build out a payment element on our custom form. That's where customers enter their billing details, and then we can submit that payment directly to Stripe client side. And then the customer is redirected to a return URL where we display this return status or this success status, completion status. And finally, we're handling fulfillment with our webhook. That's where we're actually pulling from inventory and printing shipping labels and doing all of those things that we might do when someone buys something from us. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.